Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. We're going to give folks maybe another 2 or 3 minutes to filter in here, and then we will get started with our program here in just a few minutes. All righty. So I think we'll get started here to be cognizant of everyone's time. My name is Matt Levitt. I'm the agronomist with the University of Minnesota Forever Green program. Really appreciate everyone taking a moment to join us here this morning. So the whole goal of this webinar series, which started last week and is going through this week, is to kind of give folks a primer on some of these crops that are being newly supported by the state of Minnesota through the Economic and Environmental Clusters of Opportunity, or ECO program. Just really quick, we have 2 talks last week on winter barley and winter camelina. Those are both archived and on our YouTube page. So if you're at all interested in hearing some content from those, we can set you up with that information. Just to give you a little roadmap of where we're going this week. Today, we're going to hear from 2 University of Minnesota researchers, Jake Youngers and Prabeen from University of Minnesota. And then we have a farmer, Jay Peterson, to kind of give a little real world ground truthing of some experience with Kernza on the farm. And then tomorrow, we're going to conclude our series here this spring with Joachim Wiersma and Richard Magnuson talking about hybrid winter rye. And Sienna just put the videos of those in the chat. Thanks, Sienna. We've got 2 of us here. So Sienna is the CLC adoption specialist with University of Minnesota Forever Green 2 and helps a lot with the ECO program as well. So really glad to have you all aboard here. So just as a little background on ECO, so the whole goal of the University of Minnesota Forever Green program writ large is kind of a consortium of breeding and variety development on new and emerging crops on the landscape, both perennial and winter annual, to keep brown soil covered, gain all the benefits that a farmer would get from utilizing cover crops, but with some economic benefit on the back end. So whether that's, grain or oil, or berries, nuts, etc. It's capturing and adding to environmental ecosystem services with some economic return to the farmer. So we're targeting through this program in conjunction with the Minnesota Department of Ag. Basically it's statewide and targeting areas of the state that have impaired drinking water. And because these crops that are covering the landscape, both in a perennial sense and a winter annual sense, are drawing down nitrates, protecting soil from erosion, and adding to ecosystem service benefits, which will lead to cleaner water at the back end too. So that's really what the benefit of this program is, and the whole goal kind of from a 10,000 foot level. So it's outcomes based, and it is a consortium of different partners here deploying this all over the state. And you can see that map on the right hand side there. That's kind of the target counties we're targeting with the second rollout of this program. The first iteration was just on Kernza, and the next stage now that we're rolling out is the 4 crops that we've been talking about here. So like I mentioned, it's a partnership with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture on Kernza, winter camelina, hybrid rye, and winter barley. And we're really targeting areas of the state with impaired drinking water areas. And so, what is the specifics of this program? It's funding, my technical assistance and Sienna's time as well. It provides growers with an ecosystem service payment, which is based on nitrogen leaching modeling on their farm, anywhere from about 20 to 50 bucks an acre. In addition to some risk management payment or, crop insurance, essentially. So in the event of a market failure at the back end, we're going to cover up to half the cost of production, in addition to providing some resources for seed and grain testing as well. And our goal is to get 5,000 acres of these crops planted by 2024. So if you have any interest in signing up for this program, learning more, we'd certainly like to answer your questions. So we'll drop the sign up in the chat as well, but please feel free to screen capture my contact information as well. I'll also drop it in the chat as well, and we'll get your questions answered there. So with that, we're going to transition to our first speaker here, Dr. Jake Youngers. And he's going to give us a little agronomic background on Kernza. He's obviously been very intimately involved in this crop kind of from the get-go. And after that, we're going to transition to Praveen for a little snapshot of kind of where the breeding and genetics are moving on Kernza. And then we'll wrap things up with Jay Peterson from kind of the farm level. So if you're ready, Jake, you can take it away.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt. I'm going to share my screen here. How do the slides look on your end?
They're still coming up. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, I am having a slow internet day to day here in the office, so hopefully things go smoothly. But yep, so hi everyone. My name is Jake Youngers. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics at the U, and I study sustainable cropping systems, and Kernza is a major crop in the portfolio of crops I'm doing research on. And a lot of my research is both agronomic as well as ecology focused. So a lot of our projects are measuring both the profitability and agronomic outcomes of experiments, as well as the environmental impacts, with a lot of work focused on water quality. So today I'm going to focus on the agronomics, and I have lots of talks and slides somewhere on the internet that are really focusing on the environmental aspects, including the water quality, that you can check out there. I'm also happy to answer questions about those topics after this, but this presentation is going to largely focus on how to grow Kernza in a real world environment, what we've learned so far. So I want to acknowledge there's a very large group of folks, a big team working on answering these questions of how to grow Kernza profitably. And you can see some of the folks at the U here listed, as well as some of the producers we've worked with in the past who've graciously hosted on-farm experiments. The Land Institute is also a really important partner in all of this. I also want to acknowledge the funding. A lot of this funding comes from the Clean Water Council and the Forever Green Initiative, as well as partnership through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and other state funds, as well as USDA. So by now, I think most of you are aware of what Kernza is. It's an intermediate wheatgrass, a perennial cool season grass that was introduced to the U.S. almost 100 years ago as a forage crop. And in the last 40 years or so, folks have been domesticating this species and turning it into a grain crop. And the reason we've been working on intermediate wheatgrass is because it has pretty large seeds for perennial grass. So it had a good starting point for turning it into a grain crop, has a deep, dense root system, which helps it really be perennial, as well as provide those ecosystem services that we are interested in, filtering nitrate from the groundwater, storing carbon, improving soil health. Those are all associated with that deep, dense root system you see there. And there is a lot of work going on to launch this new crop. You can think of it as a new crop enterprise. It all starts with the breeding and genetics, and you're going to hear all about that from Praveen later on. We also have to figure out how to grow this, and the agronomic research is conducted in tandem with the plant breeders, because we have new genetics and germplasm coming down the pipeline every few years. So we have to continually update our best management practices. for how to grow this, which I'm going to really focus on today. At the same time, we're also continuously measuring the environmental impacts. A lot of the end users, the folks who want to sell Kernza in their products, they want to market those environmental benefits and outcomes. So we have to have good, solid numbers backing up those claims. So we do a lot of research on measuring those outcomes. We have a team to implement this new crop, both on the landscape and in the marketplace. Matt and Sienna are key components of that team, as are others in the Forever Green Initiative. We also have a team figuring out how Kernza works as an ingredient in various food products. You'll see Kernza in a lot of beverage products right now, beer and whiskey, but it can also be milled into a flour and used in all kinds of different products, from crackers to breads. Then we need a team to figure out how to commercialize this, everything from the market research and supply chain work to make sure that this is profitable for end users. So here's what I'm just going to cover today. And Matt, make sure you cut me off if I get close to running long. There's a lot of aspects of agronomy. These are the fundamentals. We're going to start with establishment and work our way to how to terminate Kernza and incorporate it into a rotation. So before I get started, we have to have an overview of the life cycle of intermediate wheatgrass or Kernza. Typically here in the upper Midwest, we sow our seeds in late summer, early fall. I like to shoot to seed before September 1st, and I'll explain why later. But we get a little bit of vegetative growth that fall after we seed. Then it goes into its first year to overwinter, and then Kernza breaks dormancy and comes out of dormancy really early, late March usually. We start to see some greening up and spring regrowth. By mid-May, most years, stem elongation begins. So the seed head starts coming up through the stem. Flowering is usually around 4th of July, a little bit earlier. And then flowers get fertilized and the grain dries down and is ready to harvest by late July. So typically most producers harvest the grain and remove all the straw, and then Kernza continues to grow as it does, as perennials do, but just vegetatively that fall. And then the whole cycle continues again the following March. So we'll talk a little bit about dual use potential too, because that is really a key to ensuring economic profitability. So we can graze or harvest forage in the spring and in the fall around the grain harvest season. And I'll talk about details of how that can be conducted in just a bit. So keys to profitable production starts really with establishment. One of the first questions we get is, how deep should we plant our seeds? And we've done some greenhouse trials planting Kernza seeds at different depths under different soil types. And what I can tell you is the optimum seeding depth for maximizing emergence is about 3/4 of an inch. Now there is some wiggle room on that. You can see that planting at a 1/2 inch or down to an inch, it statistically gives you the same amount of emergence. But generally, if you can target for that 3/4 of an inch range, that's where you'll want to start. Do not assume that you can put this into your small grain drill and plant it 1.5 inches, 2 inches deep, then that will be a problem. So if you do use a grain drill, really got to make sure that it's not seeding too deep. That's the issue that we get when we use this type of equipment. It works. You can get the settings correct on most regular grain drills, but just be aware of that depth. Another option is a no-till setup, either like a grass seed drill or something like that. A lot of these have the ability to plant seeds pretty shallow, so these work pretty well. And you can do a no-till establishment if you adequately terminate the previous crop. That's key to that. So we've done a lot of seedings with different equipment and published the settings of those seedings in this document here. It's called Kernza Planting Equipment Recommendations. This can be found on kernza.org. I also have a link to it, as you can see, in this slide deck, which I'll share with you all at the end of this. But it can be kind of tricky. Where do you start? You can't open up the manual and find Kernza in your grain drill settings. So we did a lot of experimentation throughout the years and figured out some starting points. So hopefully that'll help you get started. So next question is, when do you seed? I think this is a better slide for showing that. I mentioned before September 1st, that's the take home message. If you're going to seed in the late summer, early fall, really shoot for the earlier end of that spectrum. In August is ideal. We did a study where we planted seeds at these various dates from mid-August to December. And then we even did some spring plantings. So Kernza requires vernalization, which means that it needs a certain duration of cold temperatures so that it will produce seed heads and flowers. And if it doesn't get those cold temperatures, it doesn't produce a seed head. And this is what happens when you plant it in the spring. So if you plant your Kernza in the spring, you will not get grain yield the first year here in the upper Midwest. So it might be an option for you if that's the only time you can plant and you're okay with not harvesting grain that first year. If you have a system where you can utilize the forage, a spring planting may be the way to go. But if you are really looking for grain harvest that first year, you have to plant in the late summer, early fall. We did this study in conjunction with a bunch of universities across the US. And here's really the take home message: plant earlier. This is showing you grain yield in pounds per acre. And on the x-axis is days after August 15th. So 0 days after August 15th. If you plant on August 15th, you're going to have your highest yield. And this regression shows that for every day that you delay planting after August 15th, you're going to lose about 7.1 pounds of yield per acre. So that makes this kind of a tricky crop for bringing into a rotation after corn or soybeans. It's not really an ideal situation to try to plant in September, October. You're really going to have a yield hit, as shown by the actual yield values here across different site years. So fertility, we've done a lot of nitrogen rate studies. What we found out is that Kernza needs about somewhere between 55 and 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre. These numbers are being reevaluated now with the new germplasm, and we're taking a closer look at how the nitrogen needs of the crop change as it ages. But I think a safe range right now, and this also depends on how much organic matter you have in your soil and the structure of the soil as well, but around that 55 to 75 pounds per acre is adequate. We're doing a lot of work looking at ways to replace synthetic nitrogen fertilizers with legumes, intercrops. So here are some photos with alfalfa intercropped in between Kernza at a vegetative stage on the left, and then right before grain harvest. So in this type of a system here, we're not harvesting or cutting the alfalfa in between the rows of Kernza. It's just there to suppress weeds and hopefully provide a little nitrogen that it fixes from the environment in the atmosphere to the Kernza. We've tried this with lots of different legume species. These are showing, this figure here shows grain yield of the Kernza without any nitrogen or legumes, that's the control, with actual fertilizer, and then intercropped with these different species of legumes from Alsike clover, birdsfoot trefoil, alfalfa, Canada milkvetch, red clover, and white clover. And what you can see here is that there's some variability year to year, and there's not really any specific legume species that always wins, that does the best across sites. It's really site dependent, and it kind of varies by age too. What we've seen the most consistency with in terms of good results is alfalfa and red clover. Those are two promising species for intercropping. We're going to learn more about how best to manage those intercropping systems pretty soon. Weed management, we can think of this, and there's organic and conventional management. What we have here are some approaches for managing weeds with the two different systems. So in organic, you may want to seed in narrow rows and rely on the competition from your Kernza to suppress the weeds. If you have a cultivator that can cultivate between rows, you could plant wider and do that like you would with corn or soybeans in an organic system. Mowing the field before Kernza goes into stem elongation, that's a way to knock back some of the weeds. But in general, we see that weed pressure declines after establishment in Kernza. Kernza is really competitive with a lot of the major weeds here in the upper Midwest. So typically it's not too much of an issue, but also be prepared that perennials weeds become more prevalent compared to the annuals in an organic system. For conventional, we have two products that are labeled for use, two herbicides labeled for use on Kernza. Make sure you check those labels carefully. Those products are Weedar 64 and Curtail M. So these are both for broadleaf control. We're working on getting dual magnum approved as a pre-emerge. That is not yet approved, but you can expect to see that in the near future. Harvest challenges. You may have heard about this from growers. When do you harvest Kernza? When's the best time? Well, it's pretty tricky because the seeds on the Kernza plant mature from the top of the spike downward. So by the time that the seeds down at the base of the spike are dry and ready to harvest, unfortunately, we start to experience some shattering of the seeds that are up on the top because those dried down and matured earlier. So we've done a lot of research to figure out when's the best time to harvest, which seeds on the spike are the largest, which ones do we want to make sure we capture during harvest, and which seeds might we be able to give up because they might be small or something like that. So just in general, the Kernza seeds dry down in this sort of three-phase system where soon after pollination, they dry down a little bit, but then there's this sort of tipping point. And for a few days, the seeds dry down very rapidly, and they go from 40-some% moisture content down to 18 or so. And then it sort of plateaus around here. And we can use this information to figure out how and when we're going to harvest. So not only is when are we going to harvest a good question, but how is another important question. We have two different approaches. We can swath and combine grain out of windrows, or we can potentially directly combine the grain off the standing plants. And there are really pros and cons to both approaches. The swathing gives us a flexible harvest timing, because then we can, even if the seeds are still a little green, a little moist, once we swath, those all dry down to a stable moisture content, and then they can be harvested. The grain, though, another advantage is that it may not need mechanical drying. The grain, typically, it's a bit cleaner, depending on how you set up your different systems. The disadvantage to swathing and combining is you got to cross your fingers and hope it doesn't rain while that grain is laying in a windrow. And it could, if it does, it's vulnerable to microbial contamination. Direct combining is an option. The advantage is fewer passes, less equipment is required. But to direct combine, you have to wait longer for all of the grain to dry down, or at least a majority of it. And if you want to get out there a little bit earlier and harvest grain and ends up being a little bit wet, and you might want to do this to avoid shattering, you're going to need facilities to dry that grain down. If you do delay harvest and let that dry down on the stems, you might get some shattering. And the plant breeders are working pretty hard to develop new lines that don't shatter, hang on to their seeds. So we are hoping that as we get new germplasm, more producers are going to be able to do the direct combining without concern for seed shatter. You've probably heard about probably the most important agronomic challenge of Kernza is that yields decline with stand age. We see very good yields in year 1, probably the best yields in year 2, and then we start to see a decline either in year 3 or year 4. It really depends on soil conditions, climate conditions, but we do see a decline in grain yield. I just want to show you some photos to illustrate this. So this is a field of Kernza in Rosemount, Minnesota. This was the May 11th. We seeded this in probably late August, the previous year, 2018. So this is what it looks like on May 11th, just starting to green up. Looks like it's a little bit spotty here and there, not such a great field. It ended up yielding over 800 pounds per acre that year. And here's the field on April 20th, 2020, so the second spring. So the first thing you might notice is that it's filled in quite well, especially within the rows. We don't see those big gaps. This is almost a month earlier than the previous picture, and you got nice lush vegetation going on. You can also start to see some material in between rows. By May 13th, that same year, you can really start to see plants greening up in between rows. Here's October 17th of that year. And then here's June 25th of 2021. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that these stands become quite thick through time. This is a few years later, and you can barely even see rows anymore. So we believe that thickening of the stand is resulting in a yield decline with stand age. So we're trying lots of different things to try to prevent that thickening of the stand, either with strip tillage, prescribed burning, and we don't have a BMP just yet to prevent this, but data are coming down the pipeline. So I want to quickly touch on dual use potential, grain and forage. As I mentioned before, this is a sure way to, I guess, have profitable economic success with this new crop. So here's how I can lay this out, the potential. A standard Kernza production system, if there's no type of grazing or forage harvest, we're just looking at harvesting that grain in the summer and then removing the straw. Straw should always be removed, whether or not you're going to use it or not. That's just going to help with the regrowth the next year. But prior to stem elongation, a producer can either graze or harvest forage. So that would be before May 10th, 15th, right around there. A producer could also choose to try to graze in the fall, like October, some of that regrowth that happens after grain harvest. Or if you're really aggressive, you could try to graze both in the spring and the fall. Now, I mentioned that this has to be done in the spring. It has to be done before stem elongation. And here's a photograph of a cross section of the stem. That's the seed head. And that photo was taken probably May 12th or something like that. And that is just coming up, emerging from the soil surface. If the cattle eat that seed head, there is no grain that year. So the grazing or forage harvest has to be done before that first node is available to either your forage harvester or your grazers. So what is the quality of this material? The spring forage is what we consider kind of lower yielding, but really high quality. It's the best quality in the system. So somewhere between 0.5 to 1.5 tons per acre, high protein content, 20-25%. If you use the relative feed value metric, 180 to 230. The summer straw is the material that's left after grain harvest, and that is considered lower quality, but there's a lot of it there. This is still higher quality than something like wheat straw or barley straw. It's still green. It has nutrients in it, 5 to 10% protein, and RFV of between 60 and 90. And then the fall forage is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's higher yielding than spring, not as good as quality, but better than the straw. So about 1.5 to 3 tons per acre, 12 to 18% protein, and a pretty good RFV value there. I won't go through the details of this, but we've done some on-farm grazing work And I'll just wrap this up because a little bit early because we're running out of time here. But figure just shows the effect of grazing on grain yield. So the red bars are grain yield that in parts of the field that were not grazed, and the blue bars are Kernza grain yields in parts of the field that were grazed by cattle. So in the first production year, year 2 of the stand, we actually saw that the grazing did have a little bit of a negative effect on grain yield. But by year 3, there was no effect. And by year 4, the grazing actually improved grain yields compared to the control, which we think might have something to do with that stand getting thicker through time. Actually putting grazers out on the field may have prevented the thickening, might have thinned it out a little bit to allow for grain yields to be better than they would be if not grazed. We did a lot of financial analyses with this. Is it worth it to get the cattle out on the field and move them around? And summed up all the input costs and the different revenues. And we generated a net return to enterprise. And this is in partnership with Al Kraus, and Caleb Anderson was the producer. And so we have our net return to enterprise here values, financials per acre, in all cases over $400 per acre net. So doing okay. And I think, Matt, I should probably wrap up, huh?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jake. That was a lot of really great information in a short amount of time. So really appreciate you making it so concrete and readable for everybody here on the call. There was a quick question that maybe we should just punt to you if you're okay. So you would recommended harvesting the straw. Do you always recommend that versus like chopping it and leaving it in the field, for like, fertility biomass replacement, or what are your thoughts there?
No, that's a really great question. I should have clarified that we need to do something with the straw, and that is a great option. It can be chopped and redistributed back onto the field, but because there's so much of it out there, if it's just left in the field standing, there'll be patches that fall over with the snow cover, and you'll have really spotty reemergence the next year. So a lot of folks, if they have an outlet for it, they harvest it and use it, and it can be put into a mixed ration or something like that as the fiber content, but it can also be chopped. That's the easiest thing to do.
Got you. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And anecdotally, I've heard that, this isn't like, harvesting oat straw. It's actually pretty, as straw goes, it's fairly high quality material, and even people that have used it for bedding find that the cattle like to eat it more so than lie on it. So, no, great. Really appreciate that information. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to punt things over to Praveen, give a little update on where breeding is at, and then we'll kind of continue on here. Great questions so far. If you have them, please feel free to continue to type your questions in the chat. Take it away, Praveen.
All right, can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Yep, we got you and can see your screen.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, thanks, Matt, Sienna, for inviting me to give a short update on what's happening in the breeding and genetic improvement program with Kernza here at the university. So my name is Praveen, and I'm the Kernza breeder. I'm also research faculty in the Department of Agronomy. I love going after Jake because he explains everything so nicely. I don't have to go to explain the backgrounds at all. But I do want to talk about the traits we are improving. Of course, very important is grain yield. We want to have as much grain from our plants as possible, but also sustained grain yield is important. Jake mentioned this as the yield decline in third year and onwards, and I'll come back to this as I explain how we are developing our varieties later. We want large seeds. We want plants that resist shattering in the field as you go through the combine, or maybe there's a storm, rain, wind. We do not want the spikes to shatter. We want the grain to thresh freely, meaning that the grain is as much dehulled or is naked as possible. And we are also making progress on that, and I'll show some data just the next slide actually. Spike traits such as spike length, spike weight, density of spikelets on the spike, we track those, but don't really actively select or deselect for any certain trait. I've seen that over the past several cycles. There's just not too much advantage or disadvantage in working on that trait, so they're just staying as is for now. Plant height has a very strong positive correlation with grain yield and seed size, so getting a dwarf wheatgrass or Kernza right now is maybe not possible, but that's not to say it's impossible. As we continue to evaluate our germplasm, maybe there would be types that are short yet produce nicely. But for now, we're targeting for optimal plant height so that the plants don't lodge, as I mentioned in the next bullet point, but not too short where yield and seed size take a hit. Diseases are very important. I track the emergence, presence absence of Fusarium head blight or scab and ergot as well. There's also leaf diseases I track, like bacterial leaf streak, barley yellow dwarf virus, and some blotch. But those I kind of group them into one category that I rate as overall plant disease or plant health, and make selections that way. End use quality, the breeders don't work with it directly, obviously, but we do provide the seed from our candidate varieties to faculties in the food science department here at the university. And you can see two faculty members, Dr. George Zanora and Dr. Pam Ismail, who work on several attributes of the grain, from storage stability to nutritional profile, protein content, antioxidant content, and how those grain can be used in what kind of product. So we're very fortunate to have a team in the food science department who works in that regard. So I want to show the progress we've been making in improving some of these traits. The top left, some fruit fly in my office. Top left is a shatter resistance. And you can see from cycle 1 did not have any data. Cycle 1 through cycle 5, which was the breeding cycle we completed last year. So we're on cycle 6 right now. On average, across the cycles, we made about 15% reduction per cycle, which is great. It's one of the traits that we're making really good progress on. It is by assumption that by the time we're done with our cycle 8, cycle 9, this issue of shattering should be non-existent in our varieties. On the top right is seed size. It's an extremely important trait, but it's also the one that is the most challenging. I think we're making just 1 to 2% increase per breeding cycle, and that's in part because of the droughts we've been seeing the past few summers, including this one actually also. As there's more heat, the seed size, it shrinks. Nonetheless, there's progress in the positive direction. Bottom left here is free threshing, or the ability for the naked grain to come out of the combine or a thresher. And that's the trait we've been making the fastest progress, where on average across each cycle, it's about 25% increase. We're seeing some sort of plateauing here, and that's to be expected. But regarding this trait as well, in the next few years, we'll probably see varieties that are near 100% free threshing. Plant height, I mentioned earlier, we're targeting for optimal plant height, and it's kind of like up and down, because year 1 plant height is nice. Year 2, the plants shoot up, like some are even like 6.5 feet tall, and nonetheless trending in negative direction, which is good. Then grain yield is it's kind of weird, because I took over this position as a breeder in cycle 3 in 2017. And before that, you will see there's a decline in progress made in improving grain yield, which is, it's probably not accurate. I just plotted the data I had. There's a lot of variables, which I did not know, because I was not sure how the plant was harvested, how the spikes were maintained in the dryer and threshing, and how much cleaning was done. But from cycle 3 onwards, there's about 15% increase in yield per cycle. And after I took over, we now have a standard method of operations where we harvest the spikes, dry them for X number of days. We use only one thresher. We use an aspirator to blow out the chaff. So a standard procedure is in place. So I think we can compare at least the cycles 3, 4, and 5, and that's where we see a steady improvement in grain yield. And I certainly can attest to that because I've seen each cycle. Most of my talk, I want to focus on variety candidates because, and then the upcoming varieties, because that's of most interest, I think, to folks who are joining this meeting. So far, we have developed 35 candidate varieties that's from cycle 1 through cycle 5, and that does not include these 10 to 12 from cycle 6 that will be initiated this fall. So last year from cycle 5, we planted 8 variety candidates. Cycle 1, the 5 from cycle 1 of that was, one of those was MN Clearwater that became the first Minnesota food grade Kernza variety. There is a second one that was obtained from cycle 2, as you can see at the bottom here, MN 1603, that will most likely be released as the next variety in a limited release because there's much better ones down the pipeline. And I'll show some pictures and data. And then we established 8 from cycle 3, of which a couple have excellent free threshing ability. And the ones from cycle 4 and 5, they're still in sort of early development phase, and they're not going to be tested until next fall, or possibly this fall if we have time to harvest them. So speaking of upcoming variety, I'm showing some data here relative to MN Clearwater, which is right here in green. The 100, that's MN Clearwater. So everything else that's on the left of MN Clearwater is better than that, and the ones on the right are not good. This is an average of 2-year data from 2 locations in Minnesota, Lamberton and St. Paul from last year, and 3 locations in 2021 that included Lamberton, Roseau, and St. Paul. You can see that MN 1607 is better slightly than MN 1603, which is second here, and the difference between them is just about a percentage in a yield advantage, so kind of negligible if you ask me. The Land Institute material TLI 701 from their 7th cycle is also pretty good. But if you look at seed size, 1603 is the best at the very front. 1607 is behind it, so they're kind of swapping positions. But based on overall performance in seed size, how the plant stands look, and how the germination is, I think MN 1603 is the winner in my books. We are going to get data this summer as well, which will be 3-year data, and after that we can make a definitive decision on which one will be released. But I'm inclined towards releasing 1603 just because how nice the plant stands look. This is some additional data. We're just looking at seed size, what we saw in the previous slide, just in chart format, broken down by environment. It just shows that the MN16s are doing quite nice in terms of seed size, and 1603 is again at the top. Quickly, I want to talk about upcoming candidates. So 1603 could get released this winter, but also at the same time we have these MN19s. These were obtained from cycle 3 breeding population, and you can see there's a few, especially 1902, with I would probably rank as 93-94% free threshing, and that's just after whatever came out of combine, we passed it through this, I call it a blue vertical cleaner. I don't know its name. All it does, it has sieves and it cleans out grain for you. So we're not really doing any dehulling, and the output is what you can see on those metal trays. So 4 out of 5 look really good, and about 2 or 3 look excellent. So I'm really excited about these. All of these are in variety trials at 2 locations under the breeding program. Jake will also be initiating his own variety trials this fall. So we have a good amount of data, some data this summer, and a good amount of data next summer on these. And the MN19s were, they're all selected for certain traits that you can see in the blue highlight boxes here in white font. The MN1902 that you saw, it's right here, and that was selected for large seed size and high threshability, which was the case. MN1904 was, threshability was near 100%. So if you go back and look at it, so MN1904, it indeed had really good threshability. So the selection that were made to pick the parents and put into a crossing block to initiate the varieties, it is indeed working, as in the genetics is working. So confident that this way of making our varieties is going to work in the future as well. Just a quick slide on what the crossing block looks. You can see Kernza plants in this 7x7 grid where there's X number of genotypes or lines replicated X number of times. There's winter rye all around it to prevent pollen contamination with another crossing block, which is somewhere to the left or right of the crossing block. That way we can maintain the purity of each candidate varieties. And I'm going to end with a couple of slides on what's ahead. So the MN22s and MN23s, the 22 and 23 indicate the year of harvest. Just want to show you the traits that the candidates were selected for. So these two in blue shade were selected for near 100% free threshing, near 0% shatter. Although they're near 100% of one trait, near 0% of another trait, there's some segregation that always happens, but for the most part, they should perform true to selection, and I expect them to do so. Now, if you see the note I have, the ones in blue shade were selected for less vigorous growth types. And as Jake mentioned, we have this problem of yield decline in Minnesota, where after 2 years of production, the yield kind of goes down rapidly. So all the plants selected for these crossing blocks or these candidate variety creation, they were not as bushy. They did not expand as much as some of the other plants, even after 2 years of growth, with 3 feet of distance around them in a spaced plant nursery. That means that, genetically, these plants are inclined to stay happy within a small area. And in my head, I'm thinking maybe that suggests that these plants aren't going to outcompete themselves and other plants in a sward type environment where a farmer plants the seed. So to get the data, it'll take several years. I'm just going to jump ahead to my last slide. If I harvested in 2022 last year, it takes several years until the farmer can get the seed, which is close to 2028. Being a perennial that has a nearly 12-month life cycle, it's a challenge in increasing the seed and turning it around, planting the same year, making sure there's enough so we can give it to a grower. But nonetheless, the 22s and 23s that you saw, it should be in growers' hands by before the end of the decade at the very least. So sorry, that was a whirlwind of presentation, but I'm here through the entirety of to this meeting, so I can take questions once we're all done with our talks.
Thanks so much for being, really appreciate that. Yeah, and exciting to see all the development work on the front end of Kernza development. I know a lot of the growers in the co-op or in other places are really anxiously looking for, especially the free threshing characteristics. So that's really exciting to see that work proceeding. So in our last 10-15 minutes, again, just remind you to type in your questions here, but we're going to turn things over to Jay Peterson. Jay, if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving folks a little geographic centering about where you're calling from, what's your relation to the co-op, Kernza, et cetera, and we'll give you the last 15 minutes here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jay Peterson. I'm glad to be here, and I really appreciate all your hard work that you guys are working on promoting and getting new varieties out. It's very important. I farm 350 acres organic in South Central Minnesota, Owatonna, Austin, Blooming Prairie is where I live, and met Carmen Fernholz many years ago, and when I transitioned from regular conventional corn and soybeans, it wasn't enough acres to really sustain that, and so started transitioning to organic. And so one of the main reasons that Kernza was attractive to me is the weed management that you can get from it. So with that, even before I planted the Kernza, I had a field that got out of hand quickly and had a lot of ragweed. So we had planted a field of teff grass for 1 year, just basically using it for straw. I got 2 cuttings. And then in 2020 planted the Kernza. 2021 was my first harvest. Jake, and they covered everything that you kind of got to think of and to decide how to harvest, how to plant. There's a huge learning curve, but everybody out here doing what we're doing helps flatten that out quite a bit. But the main intention was to help clean up some of these fields, and I didn't put a lot of acres in. I have 25. The first year the ragweed came back, so straight cutting in the end of July or August is not really an option when you have that much ragweed. So you have to, I shouldn't say that much ragweed. There were spots where the crop was thin and the ragweed came through. There was also spots where the crop was really, really nice and ragweed didn't have a chance. But even still, the straight cutting method right now yet, until we get a consistent maturity, and you don't have those green weeds, why I don't think that's an option. I would highly recommend anybody thinking about raising Kernza is to get it swapped and get a pickup head and go down that road for now. So the main reason was weed management. The other thing is time management. Balancing my workload in the summer, transitioning to a late July, August. I'm anticipating a little earlier harvest this year in early August, just because of the dry weather. Where I'm at, we're pretty dry right now. The corn and beans are really just starting to show some stress, and so it's going to, going back to the labor management, it's a summertime crop where it evens out your workload. So I'm on my 3rd year of this crop now. We'll be harvesting it this year, and then looking at probably terminating it and putting in a soybean or a legume. I would think that would give me a very clean fields for a good clean soybean crop. Some of the other things that I've had to learn is how to fertilize. I've tried a couple different things. I've used some liquid fish, which is really smelly. And then I've got a spreader that I use for spreading pelletized chicken litter. I did that this year at about the rates that are suggested by the U of M.
Now, did you do that in the fall or the spring, Jay?
I just did that this spring for the 3rd year. Yep. I didn't have enough lined up to get it done separately, so I did it all in one shot. So yeah, there's a lot of things to think about. I think one of the storage, there's every step of the way it's a different crop, and it's kind of like I'm actually in my office right now. It's my work truck. I've started a few businesses, and this whole crop feels kind of like a new business. You don't start right out of the gate usually with all kinds of work and all kinds of money and all kinds of answers. It takes years to develop all the skills that you need to get a product to market. And this is what everybody is doing here. And it's really nice to have the backup, because none of us would be doing this alone. So I don't know what else does anybody want to hear. The storage of the crop is, combining the crop, I guess, like I've touched on, that is the swathing, the pickup head, setting the combines. That's all part of what we can learn from on these videos.
Have you had to make any big mechanical adjustments, both on the planting end and on the pickup head end to make sure you're getting all the kerns out of the windrow?
So on the planting part of Kernza, I had a drill. It was an experiment. So I set the drill as light as I possibly could, and ended up coming back over the same ground again, because just learning that setting, I had to set it really, really light, which worked out great. As far as harvesting, yeah, there's settings on the combine that you want to follow, and I think some of the other the basic rule is setting a combine to set the concave as tight as possible and run the rotor as fast as possible. And you can adjust your fans by looking and seeing what you have in your tank. That's right now, that's about as good as you can get. Crank it up.
Can you harvest with just a regular rotor head too, or do you need to make adjustments?
Matt, I have it's an old 1660, and it actually had small grain screens sieves in it, and but I have done nothing special to the rotor and concaves. I know you can search for more specialty type rotors and things like that, but to start off with, that's probably it wouldn't be a bad investment if you can get the right one, but I couldn't recommend anything what to get on that front.
Gotcha. There was a question that came through about what moisture that you're looking for when you cut it.
Well, I like Jake said, when you're out looking at it, doing some more scouting, and you see the tops are maturing, look at the seed sizes, look at the bottom ones. If they're bigger, why let it go a while and try and save the big ones. They will be green. The crop will be head high, 5 feet tall. There's a lot of material to run through a swather, but I would definitely, I think at that point, as long as the bottom ones are not too soft and too much moisture in them, why you would be fine. You want to check them all, but if you pinch those and there's moisture coming out, like, go do something else. You're better off letting it sit, and maybe have to sacrifice a couple of seeds, but you'll be much better off down the road by letting it mature a little longer.
Gotcha. I know this is kind of a can of worms question, but
Yeah.
what's kind of your experience been with marketing it, and how long have you had to store it at some points before you're able to find a market?
Well, that is a big can of worms that we've been working on at the co-op, the Perennial Promise Growers Co-op, for well over 2 years now. And like I said, that is like starting a whole new business, where it takes time to develop your market, and it takes experience and takes time to develop and put the right people in the right places. I have my 21 crop still. I have our 22 crop is being processed for seed. 4 of us growers have our seed being cleaned right now and delivered to Elberly. Seed is actually buying it, and they will be distributing it. We've had some really wonderful, what do you say, improvements to our marketing outlook here in the last month and a half, where there's some bigger markets moving, to where it's the most positive I've felt about the marketing in a couple of years. It's I would not expect to take it to market and, you know, haul it in and get paid like you do with other crops. This is a new child still. As long as we've been working with it, it's still very new. I would expect you to hold on to your grain for 12 months. So that's why people, you know, don't really go out and plant their whole farm to it. Take a 20-acre patch or 40, you know, if you want to do that much, you can. But I would suggest you be ready to hang on to it for a while. But at the same time, like I said, it's a can of worms. We are experiencing some really good positive feedback just recently. So.
And kind of the last question I was wanting to ask you was, how do you view this kind of fitting into your long-term cropping plan? I know you said you're taking your 20 acres out, putting it back to beans next year. Are you going to incorporate Kernza next year? Or was this kind of a trial that you maybe will think about harder in the future, or where are you kind of at with that?
Right this year, I don't have the plans to replant any, but there is another field that after this year, I think we'll be looking at putting it back into. So.
And kind of that same rotation, are you going to use it to like clean up fields, or is this like preceding soybeans, or what does that look like?
It is a tool to clean up fields that have gotten out of hand. Like, just for example, I have it's about 60 acres that needs to get. It's actually going to have. It's got rye and wheat on it now. It's kind of split now. Next year will be rye on the whole thing, and then after that would be Kernza for 3 years, just so that you get that cutting and that perennial weed suppression from the rye, from the other the wheat and stuff like that. So it would be a wonderful transition crop if you are just getting out of some chemical farming. You want to transition. It would be a wonderful crop to have a short season crop, like a sweet corn or peas, and then clean it up. You have your final application of a prohibited substance. You start that date, you plant your Kernza, and in 3 years you can have organic Kernza. So that would be a wonderful crop to transition with. So I wish I knew now what I didn't know then, but that's how we all learn.
Right. Yeah, that's like you're saying, it's bootstrapping and education, you know, all along the way. One more question
Yes.
about what kind of bin floor do you need to store it? Do you have any feedback there?
Yeah, right. I have, if you have a large amount, I have a hopper bin. So I have a 1,500 bushel hopper bin, and it has air in it. If you had a flat floor, I would say that you would have to find a small opening. I have one bin. It's a 12,000 bushel bin with very small round holes, and it's a flat surface. It's just holes that are punched, but it has to allow some airflow. I would put it in there if I had no other options, but I would actually maybe suggest finding some totes as to put it in, if you have a way to move them around easy enough. Doesn't answer a lot of questions, but there are some bin floors that are raised and they have big slots in them for a lot of airflow. I think you would end up with some issues. You might lose some, but it wouldn't be enough to justify buying a whole new bin or bin floor.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I've seen in my couple months starting out here, I have seen a couple folks like storing it in a wagon, you know, and without a covering on top, as long as it's dry. The one thing, you know, with storing in a tote, you know, just probably goes without saying, but it's got to be dry before it goes in a tote. Otherwise it you know, it's spoil.
It's got to be dry before it goes in a wagon too. You'll have heat. They'll heat up too. I actually did. I'm glad you mentioned that. I did store some extra 22 crop in a wagon with a tarp on it in the winter. But then once it warms up, you just back it in and just open the tarp so the heat comes out. Yeah.
Great. Well, if there's any last remaining questions here, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you, Jay, for taking the time from your work truck / office to give us some real world information on Kernza. And thank you to Jake and Praveen as well for giving your kind of background agronomic and breeding talks as well. Just as a call out to folks, we will be recording this, so it will be put on YouTube after the fact. If you'd like to rewatch or share with friends, neighbors, etc., please feel free to do that. And then the last webinar in this series is going to be on hybrid rye. So that will be tomorrow at 11 o'clock. If you have any interest, we'd love to have you. Feel free to join on. Otherwise, Sienna, as a last note here, Sienna did post a list of Kernza field days. There's a very comprehensive list of Kernza field days all over the upper Midwest. There's some specific ones upcoming here very soon. Christy Cowden from Great River Greening posted there's a Kernza field day Monday, July 10th in St. Peter from 5 to 8 p.m. KernzaCon is happening next week on the St. Paul campus with some farm tours as well. So you can Google KernzaCon, you'll get more information there. The other thing is A-Frame Farms or Carmen Fernholtz and Luke Peterson are also having a Kernza field day on July 13th at their place too. And if you Google that, or you can go to that link site there with Kernza information. So lots of opportunities to get your feet wet or dirty, however you want to say, with Kernza here this summer. So with that, we'll conclude. Really appreciate everybody being on, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.